All right. Happy Chanukah, everyone. Or as they say in Yiddish, Freilichen Chanukah, which means happy Chanukah. Or some people say Lichtige Chanukah, which means it should be a enlightened Chanukah, which I don't really know what they mean by that exactly, but it sounds nice. So hopefully everyone's lights will burn on Chanukah. Okay, so what we're going to do tonight is talk about some of the basic ideas of Chanukah and ask some pretty important questions about them, and hopefully come away with some not so basic ideas, a deeper look, a new perspective on some ideas about Chanukah. So there's two main stories to Chanukah, and I put them on the source sheet. The first appears in Al Hanisim. Al Hanisim is a prayer that we insert into our prayers on Chanukah. We also insert it into benching, into Birkat HaMazon, the grace after meals. And it basically tells over an important part of the story of Chanukah. So we can just read that. And just to get to, in advance, what I'm going to do is we're going to ask a bunch of questions at the beginning of the class, and then build up some ideas, and then we'll be able to answer all the questions. So we're going to ask questions without really answering them, and then answer them eventually. So let's just read from Al Hanisim, this prayer that we insert, and it tells us a bit of the story. So it says that in the days of Matisyahu, son of Yochanan the high priest, the Hasmonean. So this was Matisyahu, sort of the leader, the father of the Maccabees, also known as the Hasmoneans, the Hashmonaim, and his sons. When the evil Greek kingdom rose up against your people, Israel, we're talking to God, we're praying, so we talk to God, your people, Israel, to make them forget your Torah and to turn them away from the statutes of your will. So the Greeks sought to make us forget the Torah, turn us away from God's will, God's law. And you, God, in your abundant mercy, stood by them in their time of distress. You defended their cause. You delivered the mighty into the hands of the weak, the many into the hands of the few, even though the Greek army vastly outnumbered the Jewish army of the time. Miraculously, the Jewish people were victorious. It was not a quick one battle. It was many years of fighting. And the wicked into the hands of the righteous. And you made yourself a great and sanctified name in your world. It sanctified God's name. People saw that God stood by his people. And for your people, Israel, you performed a great deliverance and redemption unto this very day. Afterwards, after the delivery, after the redemption, after we defeated the Greeks, your sons entered the Holy of Holies of your abode, cleaned your temple, purified your sanctuary, and kindled lights in the courtyards of your sanctuary. They lit the menorah, that's what we mentioned, and designated these 8 days of Chanukah to thank and praise your great name. That's what we say in our prayers and in our benching, in our grace after meals. And there seems to be something missing from this, right? What is not mentioned in the Al Hanisim prayer, which you might think is important to the story of Chanukah? Anyone want to jump in?
The menorah.
What about it? It says kindled lights in the courtyards.
Oh, all right.
Well, you're on the right track. It just says kindled lights, right? It doesn't say anything about any miracle having to do with the lights, right?
Right.
So that's the just something. But the answer may be, well, what is if you think about it, which is the more important miracle? The fact that the Jewish people were saved, were able to continue to observe the Torah, that they didn't assimilate into Greek culture, they weren't killed, they weren't destroyed, right? And miraculously, a small army defeated a large army, or that some lights, in the temple burned for 8 days miraculously. Which is more important? Which is more significant? I think I would say the first one, right? That it's a nice thing that the menorah burned for 8 days, but what if it hadn't? Would life be that different? We wouldn't light our menorah maybe, but everything else would seemingly be the same. But if the Jewish people hadn't won those battles, hadn't won the war, there would be no more Jewish people. We would just all be a bunch of Greeks walking around in togos or whatever they were, right? So things would be different. So I think that we can understand that we're talking about the most important part of the Chanukah miracle, which was that we were saved and we defeated the Greek army. So then let's go on to number 2 in the sources, and here is a piece of the Talmud, and from the Talmud, and it's a famous piece. It says, "My Chanukah." What is Chanukah about? And it's discussing over there the lighting of the menorah, which we do on Chanukah, and basically it gives some laws about it, and then it says, well, what is this about anyways? Why are we lighting the menorah, the lights on Chanukah? I use the word menorah just because that's what people call it. Menorah is really what they had in the temple. I mean, menorah could just mean a candelabra. Some people call it a Chanukah, from the word Chanukah. It's lights. Chanukah lights is really, you don't need, by the way, to have like a fancy menorah. You could just put candles next to each other. You could use tea lights. They don't have to be attached in any way. They just have to be in a line. So, but the menorah is what they had in the temple. The menorah in the temple was actually only 7 branches, not 8 or 9 like our Chanukah menorahs. Ours are 8 because of the 8 days of Chanukah. And actually, we're not allowed to create a replica of what they actually had in the temple. So we're actually not allowed to make a 7 branched menorah. So, but our menorah, I'm going to just call it a menorah. So the Talmud wonders, what is Chanukah all about? Why are we lighting the menorah? So it tells the other part of the story. What is Chanukah and why are lights kindled on Chanukah? The Gemara answers. The sages taught on the 25th of Kislev, the Jewish month of Kislev, which is when Chanukah starts. We today started the next month of Teves, but on the 25th of Kislev, the days of Chanukah are 8. One may not eulogize, okay. One may not fast. What is the reason? Okay. When the Greeks entered the sanctuary, they defiled all the oils that were in the sanctuary by touching them, and when the Hasmonean monarchy overcame them and emerged victorious over them, they searched and found only 1 cruse of oil, 1 jug that was placed with the seal of the high priest, undisturbed by the Greeks. There was only one jug left that hadn't been defiled, and there was sufficient oil there to light the menorah, the candelabrum, for only 1 day. A miracle occurred, and they lit the candelabrum from it 8 days. The next year, the sages instituted those days and made them holidays with recitation of Hallel, of thanks of God, and special thanksgiving and prayer and blessings. And although it doesn't say it explicitly, but it's coming to explain that, and the lighting of the menorah. So here we get the other half of the story. Here in the Talmud, it teaches us the more, famous and recognized part of the Chanukah story, because that's what we do each year, is we light the candles, which is that when the Jewish army finally reclaimed the temple from the Greeks and they went in, they could only find 1 jug of oil or 1 cruse of oil that wasn't defiled, that was pure, and that could be used for the lighting of the menorah. And miraculously, that one cruse, 1 night's worth, lasted 8 nights, a great and wonderful miracle. And therefore, we light the menorah each year. So going back to the point that I just made previously, that seemingly out of these 2 miracles, if I would ask you which is more important, which is more significant, and since I've already answered the question, then you should all agree with me, I hope, that the more significant miracle is that the Jewish people were saved, and saved from destruction, saved from assimilation. The Jewish people are still here today. So why then do we make such a big deal about the miracle of the lights of the menorah, and seemingly less of a big deal about the salvation of the Jewish people? That's going to be question number 1, really, for tonight. Why is it that we put such an emphasis? People think of Chanukah, they think of the lights of the menorah. Why do we put an emphasis on recognizing that miracle? Why don't we do something? Why don't we put an emphasis and do something that, we thank God, but we don't have like a special act that somehow recognizes the victory in the war. So why is that? That would seem to be more important and more significant. Okay, that's question number 1. Hold on to it tight, because it's going to be the last question that we answer tonight. Okay, if anybody wants to suggest an answer, you're welcome to. Okay. Moving on. There's a very, very strange midrash. If you've heard it before, you know it. It's strange. The midrash teaches us, our sages teaches us, that among the various decrees that the Greeks, during the time of the Greek rule of Israel, during that general period, one of the decrees that they made was what seems to be the strangest thing. Look at source number 3. And the decree, this is a midrash, it says darkness. It's talking about the second verse in the Torah. It says that the world was null, and was void and dark. And it says that when it says the world was dark, it's somehow a reference to the period of the exile of Greece, when we were under Greek rule. But putting that aside, what's important to us tonight is that it says darkness refers to the exile of Greece, who darkened the eyes of Israel with their decrees, when they said to them, and here's the decree, write for yourselves on the horn of the ox that you have no portion in the God of Israel. In Hebrew, ein lachem chelek be'elokei Yisrael. Write, kitvu lachem al keren ashar. Write for yourself on the horn of an ox that you have no portion in the God of Israel. I've seen stranger things, but this is up there, right? What is going on? Why would we can ask, we have 2 questions here. First of all, what is this? What are they saying even? What do we mean? We have no portion in the God of Israel. What does it mean to have a portion in the God of Israel? And that's not, we could explain that. It may not be so strange, but why are they telling the Jewish people, you got to write this on the horns of your ox? Anyone have any ideas?
Yeah, I think they were really telling them that since you're not going to be allowed to serve serve God as you believe, that you then in turn God will forget you, and then you're going to disappear into us. And they wanted to write it so he'll remind.
You're explaining what it means to not have a portion in the God of Israel. Is that what you mean?
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah, you're saying like you'll give up your connection with God and assimilate. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay, good. That's I'm definitely on the right track, and it's probably very simply put. That's how I think you could say it. But what about writing this on the horn of an ox? Any ideas about that?
Reinforcement.
Reinforcement. It's like, writing lines on the chalkboard. Write it over and over again until you get the point. Perhaps. Okay. Now, Rabbi, another decree that
Rabbi?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I've been thinking about your first question, and something that comes to my mind is that the process that it takes to make the oil, it's not a process that can be making out in few hours or thing, because you have to crush you have to get the olive, you have to crush it, the process that it takes, and the determination that the Jewish people, the young men, the Maccabees, the determination in trying to find at least 1 barrel of oil in the sanctuary. They didn't give up. They didn't say, well, at least we made the war, we can. No, they will go search. The determination that they put into it in order to find that makes it really.
Okay, beautiful. So you're saying there's more to it than just the the miracle itself, but it represents the determination that the people had at the time to
Yeah.
find it.
Yeah,
And,
and the thing that at the time the high priest, they have to burn the oil in the sanctuary every day. So they didn't want to, I mean, that's my thought. They didn't want to miss that day. So
right.
they were doing all the effort at least to fulfill that mitzvah of lighting the oil in the Beit HaMikdash.
Very nice. Very nice. Okay. Now, one of the other decrees, the perhaps more famous of the decrees that the Greeks made, is quoted in this collection, Otzar HaMidrashim, Midrash collection. It's also in the book of Maccabees, or Megillat Antiochus, and it says as follows: number 4, at that time the Greeks arose over the Jewish people and nullified the covenant which the Jews made with their God, Shabbat, Rosh Chodesh, and Brit Milah. So there were 3 specific mitzvot that the Greeks went after. Also traditions that they prevented, they forbade Torah study. But besides for that, we have here specifically, they forbade the observance of Shabbat. They forbade the observance of Rosh Chodesh, which is the establishment of the new month. In Jewish law, when there's we follow the lunar calendar, and when we see a new moon, we sanctify a new month. So nowadays already the calendar has been set. It's a whole story in itself, but it used to be that each month witnesses would see the new moon. They would go to the high court and they would declare it Rosh Chodesh. They would declare the new Jewish month. Now it's already been perpetually declared in advance, but so we actually still have that. It's just already been done for us like a couple thousand years ago. Well, not a couple thousand, but maybe like 1,500 years ago. But that's the mitzvah. That's the idea of Rosh Chodesh. You see the new moon and you sanctify the new Jewish month. And the third is the Brit Milah, is the circumcision. And that was the third mitzvah that the Greeks went after. So we're going to ask the question, why these 3? Is there anything specific about these 3 mitzvos that they decided to prohibit, they decided to make decrees against? You know, we have so many to choose from, 613, maybe not, well, some of those are negative, but we have hundreds of positive commandments. Why is it that they chose these ones to go after? And number 5, source number 5, actually, let's just see how many questions we've done so far. We did, why do we make such a big deal about the miracle of the lights? We did, why are they having us write on the horns of our oxen? And specifically, why are we writing that we have no portion in the God of Israel? What's that supposed to mean? So that's 3 questions. And question number 4 is, why did they go after these 3 mitzvot, these 3 commandments, Shabbat, Rosh Chodesh, and Brit Milah? And now we'll have question number 5, which is going to come from Ma'oz source. So the famous song that we sing after we light the menorah, famously translated to Rock of Ages, but in Hebrew it's called Ma'oz Tzur. And one of the stanzas talks about the story of the Greeks at the time of the Chanukah, meaning the different stanzas actually deal with different eras. It talks about the Egyptian exile, and it talks about the Babylonians and Persia, the story of Purim. We say all this, and then we finally get to the story of Ma'oz Tzur. And over here, it says as follows. It says that the Greeks gathered against me. Yevanim nikbetzu alai. The Greeks gathered against me in those days. They breached the walls of my towers. They defiled all the oils. And from the one remnant of the flasks, this is all, it's a poem in Hebrew. It rhymes in Hebrew, yeah. So in English, this translation at least is also trying to be poetic a little bit, but they defiled all the oils, and from the one remnant of the flasks, a miracle was wrought for the roses. So what are we talking about? Roses here? We're referring to the Jewish people at that time, or the Maccabees, the Hashmonaim, the Hasmoneans, as roses. And then it goes on. So my question number 5 is, why are we referring to the Jews of the time, or the Maccabees, as roses. In Hebrew, it's shoshanim. Naaseh nes la shoshanim in Hebrew. A miracle was done for the shoshanim. A shoshana is a rose. So why is it that we're referring to the Jewish people as roses in this poem? Okay. So those are our questions. I think that's it. That's it. Number 5. So again, just to recap. Question number 1, why do we put such emphasis on the lighting of the menorah, the miracle of the lights, and not as much emphasis on the miracle of the victory in the war, the salvation of the Jewish people at the time? Question number 2 and 3 go together. The Greeks decree upon us, write on the horns of your ox that you have no portion in the God of Israel. What does that mean, no portion in the God of Israel? And why are we writing that? Why do they want us to write that on the horn of an ox? It seems very strange. Question number 4, why did they decree specifically against Shabbat, Rosh Chodesh, the new month, and circumcision, Brit Milah? And question number 5, why is it that in the liturgical poem of Ma'os Tzur, we refer to the Jews of that time as Shoshanim, as roses? What is that supposed to mean? So someone recently was telling me about the new, I don't know how new, I guess, relatively new Netflix show called The Queen's Gambit, which is it's based on a book from the 70s, I think, or the 80s, and it tells the story of a girl who's a young girl who's a chess prodigy, and it's for whatever reason it's extremely popular. But what's most interesting to me is that although this game has been around for a long time, chess, 1,500 years at least, suddenly chess is super popular. It's one of the besides, I mean, you combine quarantine with this show, and the chess sets are flying off the shelves. An article, I mean, I Googled it, there's lots of articles about this, but one article from NBC said that after the show premiered in October, sales of chess sets spiked by 87% in the United States. Book sales about chess rose 603%. And this comes after flat and negative growth in those categories in past years. So all of a sudden, chess is super popular. Again, it's a bit of a combination of in general, board game sales are up, I think, but it's definitely majorly impacted by this Netflix hit called The Queen's Gambit. They interview someone in this article, Jeff Myers. He has an online retailer called the Chess Store, and he said he's never experienced demand like he's seeing now. He said he watched the show and he said, oh, maybe this will help sales, but he had no idea what was coming. And now he doesn't, he's out of stock basically. And if only he had seen, and loaded up before. So this, I mean, it didn't surprise me, but if we think about it, it's really interesting, right? Here we have a game that's been around. All of a sudden Netflix puts a show on TV, and this is, or it's not TV anymore, I guess, on Netflix. And all of a sudden, this is, the most popular game out there. And I was thinking that if people can be influenced so easily to take up a game, or to change really, to start signing up for chess clubs and all of that, which also has happened, if they could just buy a TV show, right? So what other influences do Hollywood, the media, the general culture have on us? Meaning people go through life watching tons of stuff on TV, Netflix, whatever, reading the newspapers, websites, all day long is what people do. Facebook, social media, billboards, we're inundated with information, or other words that we could use to describe these things, but it's flying at us day in and day out all the time. And how much does this engineer the way that we view things? And I think taking this little example of just how many people took up chess as a result of one show, I think we can probably agree that the impact is vast, and people's thinking is greatly impacted by what they take in and what they absorb from their screens and and general life around them. I mean, it's an obvious point, but it's important for us to consider it. So the truth is that the Rambam, Maimonides, writes about this basic idea back in the 12th century. And the Rambam says, it's number 6 here, he says it is the nature of man's character and actions to be influenced by his friends and associates, and for him to follow the local norms of behavior. So he's not talking only about, he's not talking at all about media and TV shows, because they didn't exist in his time. He's just talking about the environment that a person spends time in. But it's now our environment is expanding. It's the people that we're with. It's everything that we take in our lives. And Rambam says it's the nature of man's character to be influenced. In other words, it's totally normal. It's totally normal. This is what happens. And for somebody not to be influenced, they have to be going against their nature, right? And it's obvious. You look at the world around you, and the world, our country certainly is divided into little groups, basically, right? Whether it's political views or religious views or any type of views, like everybody in their, occasionally somebody breaks out and goes to a different view, often because they have actually absorbed influences from somewhere else, not on their own, sometimes on their own. But you have, this part of the country believes this part of the country believes this. Like, why does it work that way? Because everybody is influenced by the environment, the people around them, their teachers, the particular channel on TV, the news channel that they watch. Everybody's influenced by what they take in. And that's what the Rambam is telling us. And the Rambam tells us, Maimonides tells us, therefore, one should associate with the righteous and be constantly in the company of the wise so as to learn from their deeds. Now that we know that we're influenced and it's natural to be influenced, well, let's try to be influenced by the righteous. So if you can imagine somebody going to a workplace, it's hard to imagine that right now, but in a workplace, I don't know if maybe some of you do, I know, but it's less, and it's obviously less nowadays. But in a workplace, there's different types of people. There's people who gossip all day and talk about other people and talk down about other people, and then there's people who speak positively. So and are looking to help or whatever. So who should we be spending our time with? So Maimonides says, well, if you spend time with the negative and the gossipers, then you're going to be influenced by that, and you'll become like that. So choose wisely who you spend your time with. He goes really far with this. He says, a person who lives in a place where the norms of behavior are evil and the inhabitants not follow the straight path. So such a person should move to a place where the people are righteous and follow the ways of the good. You should move. Get up and move. If you're living somewhere where there's a bad influence, move to somewhere where there's a good influence. If all the places with which he is familiar and of which he hears reports follow improper paths, as in our times, he's writing that in his times, or if he is unable to move to a place where the patterns of behavior are proper because of the presence of bands of raiding troops or for health reasons. So basically, if it's too dangerous to travel, whether it's for personal health reasons or because it's a dangerous country, so he should remain alone in seclusion. As it states in Eicha Lamentations, let him sit alone and be silent. So Rambam Maimonides goes so far as to say, listen, if there's no way to avoid people except by staying home, then stay home if the influences are negative. And then he says, and if they are wicked and sinful and do not allow him to reside there, unless he mingle with them and follow their evil behavior, he should go out to caves, thickets, and deserts rather than follow the paths of singers. So he goes really far with this. But it brings home the point, which is he's saying there's no real way to resist this. If we don't want to be affected by this, then if we don't want to be impacted by our environment, if we have the sense that it's a negative environment, that we're surrounded by what he refers to as evildoers, then one should run away as if it's the last resort. But that's what one has to do. But my point in bringing this in, I don't think any of us would so easily run away from wherever we are. If maybe if it's really bad. I don't think, thank God, it's not so bad. But it's a real thing, and it's natural that our environment impacts us, and it's so important to be aware of that. Now, how as Jews do we relate to our environment? So in the story of Chanukah, in that time, the Greeks had really conquered much of the area. Many, Alexander the Great built a great empire. Then it was split after he died. It was split into three generals, and one of them was the Syrian Greeks, and that's who we deal with in the Chanukah story. But the Greek Empire was vast. The Greeks are known for their great wisdom and developing a culture. They were also idolaters. They were into science. They were into all sorts of things. But what they weren't into was Judaism, that's for sure. And they went to great efforts to try to, stuff their way of life down our throats, basically, right? And that's what these decrees are really about, is that they couldn't stand the idea that we wanted to be different, that we didn't want to accept their culture and their beliefs, and that we had our own our own beliefs and our own culture and our own way of looking at the world, our own perspective. And certainly in the world, right, people look back at the Greeks, and they're looked at as sort of the origins of science and wisdom, and they were very bright and smart, great thinkers. But there's a really important idea brought out in the Midrash, and it's number 7 on the sources. It says, if someone tells you that there is wisdom among the nations, believe them. There's lots of wisdom among the nations. There's what to learn from the nations of the world. But that there is Torah among the nations, do not believe them. If somebody tells you there's Torah, don't believe them. As the verse states, in Eicha and Lamentations, her king and her princes are among the nations, Torah is no more. That once we went into exile, it's talking about Jerusalem, the Jewish people, her king and her princes are among the nations, we're in exile. Torah is no more. There's no Torah in the exile, meaning it's not to be found among the nations of the world, and even among the Jewish people, it's greatly diminished by exile. But certainly what this Midrash is trying to bring out is there's no Torah among the nations. What do we mean by Torah? What does the word Torah even mean? So Torah means teachings or guidance. So we don't look, what this Midrash is basically telling us is there's plenty of wisdom among the nations. There's lots to learn from the nations, but we don't look there for guidance on how to live our lives. For that, we look to our tradition, to the Torah. The Torah is the Torah. The Torah is the guide, is the life guide, the guidebook. Now, for example, in number 8, with the Talmud, we see that there's what to learn from the nations. Rabbi Akiva said, in 3 aspects of their conduct, I like the Medes, the Medians. We should learn from their practices. When they cut meat, they cut it only on the table, not on their hands. That's an explanation there. Okay, I don't know. I guess it's more clean, or they won't cut themselves, or I don't know what. When they kiss only the back of the hand. It's more respectful. When they hold counsel, they only hold counsel in the field, so others will not hear their secrets. Rabbi Gamliel said, in 3 aspects of their conduct, I like the Persians. They are a modest people. They're modest in their eating. They're modest in the lavatory, in the bathroom, and they are modest in another matter, i.e. in sexual relations. So there's modesty among the Persians. And he says, I like that. But what they're doing, they're saying, they're looking to the nations and they see wisdom, but they're looking at it through their prism of Torah and saying, that which I see among the nations, how does that fit into the outlook of Judaism? Rather than just accepting what they hear and what people are saying on the streets or what they're saying on TV, without first saying, so, what is the Jewish perspective on this? How should we relate to this? Because remember, like Maimonides said, even if we think that we're making a decision on our own, but it's natural for us to be influenced. Everybody who you ask believes in what they believe in, right? They believe that because that was the nurture that they received. That was the environment that they grew up in. And ultimately, what this midrash is telling us, we don't look to the nations for Torah, for guidance in life. We could take the wisdom, we could take certainly good traits, and we can examine it through the prism of Torah thought and see is it something that I should learn from, or is it something that I shouldn't learn from? But we don't look there for guidance in general. And that was important in the fight against the Greeks as well, was recognizing and standing up and saying, there's this culture which is admired by the whole world, but that doesn't just mean that we're going to just give in and accept and assimilate and become Greeks. I mean, many Jews did in that time, but many, the Maccabees as the leaders, stood up and said, no, we're not just going to just assume that this is the way, that this is a better way, but rather we're going to stand up. In Exodus, when God is telling Moshe that he's going to go to Pharaoh and tell him, the famous, let my people go. So it says at source number 9, say to Pharaoh, so says Hashem, so says God, Israel is my firstborn son. What does it mean that Israel is a firstborn son? B'ni b'chari Yisrael. Israel is my firstborn son. What is the significance about being a firstborn? So the answer, I think, can shed also, can teach us an important foundational idea about how to relate to our environment and how not to be influenced by our environment. And that is that we have to remember, we have to realize that we are B'ni B'chari Yisrael. We are the firstborn, or what's referred to as the firstborn. But what does it mean that we're the firstborn? So Rabbi Soloveitchik, who was the head of Yeshiva University, so he explained that, first of all, if the Torah is telling us we are the firstborn son, it's saying that the other nations are also the children of God. Just we are to view ourselves as the firstborn, and we're to tell Pharaoh that we're the firstborn. But what does it mean to be the firstborn? So he says, every nation is a child of God. Every human being was created in the divine image, in the image of God. But when God reveals himself to us at Sinai and chooses us as the chosen people, as the Am Segula, a treasured nation, which really started already previously when Abraham, as the descendants of Abraham really chose that role. And Isaac decided to follow his father Abraham. Esav decided not to. Yishmael decided not to. And then Isaac, Yitzchak had two sons, Yaakov and Esav. Yaakov decided to follow his father's footsteps. Esav decided to go a different direction. And eventually we are, the Jewish people are from that line. They're from the line of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, who chose to have this relationship with God, and therefore merited, when God saw that they are going to be the inspiration for the world, then it's their descendants who will be that, who will get the Torah and be the chosen people, the treasured nation, that is charged with the responsibility of being the Bechor, the firstborn. And it's a responsibility. It's not to ignore and abandon the rest of the world, says Rav Soloveitchik. We're the firstborn. And a critical task of a firstborn is to be a role model and an effective teacher for the other children in the family, and in this case, for the other nations. We accomplish this through self-development, setting an example, sanctifying God's name, behaving honestly, treating others nicely, with dignity, and God forbid, not the opposite, not doing things that are a desecration of God's name. And so he says, this is what God had in mind when he gave Moses the task of redeeming the Jewish people from slavery. He says, go tell Pharaoh, this is my firstborn. As long as you refuse to let them go, they're not going to be able to fulfill their mission in the world. They're not going to go receive the Torah. They're not going to be able to take up their task to be that light unto the nations, to be that example, to be that firstborn. So Pharaoh, you're holding up the works. You're hurting yourself, Pharaoh. So he tells Moshe, go tell Pharaoh, they are my firstborn, let them go, let them do their job in the world. And if we remember that, if we remember and we recognize our responsibility as influencers of the world, if we're proud to be that, proud to be Jews, proud to be provided with the treasure of the Torah as a guidebook for ourselves, and therefore and effectively for the rest of the world, then, and we carry that with us, then we're much more resistant to influence. As long as somebody views themselves as an influencer, it's harder, much more difficult to be influenced. And we see this in different situations. Teachers, they are the inspiration. They don't get influenced, even if they have a bad pupil. And if anything, they are the influencers. And in many areas, it's like that. But that's a general idea of how to deal with this problem, because Maimonides is telling us it's natural. This is the natural way of the world, is we just follow the crowd. We just get swept up by our environment, and whatever everyone else is saying, that's what we start to say. Whatever values other people have, that's what we start to have. If we see on TV, on advertisements, on everything, the values of materialism and glorifying all sorts of things that should not be glorified. So if we don't resist somehow, then we will be impacted by that. How do we resist? We remember who we are. Remember, B'ni B'chori Yisrael, we are the firstborn. We have a Torah as a guide that we can turn to, and it's our job to influence the world and not to be influenced. So with that in mind, let's look back to the Greeks. The Greeks were aware of this. The Greeks were aware that the Jewish people thought, the Greeks wanted everyone to be like them. They had this massive empire. You have the Jewish people resisting. They didn't like that one bit. And they were aware that it was the Jewish people's Torah and also the recognition of the unique role that the Jewish people play that was keeping them from assimilating and joining the Greek culture. And therefore, they went after the mitzvot that tie us to God in a unique way, that are covenants with God, that show our unique relationship with God. So the three mitzvot that they went after, all in some way, are a covenant with God. In fact, the language that's quoted in the Midrash that we read back in number 4 was, the Greeks arose over the Jewish people and nullified the covenant which the Jews made with their God, Shabbat, Rosh Chodesh, and Brit Milah. So the word for covenant in Hebrew actually is bris. And so Brit Milah is the obvious one, that it's a covenant because it's in the word itself, bris milah. But the question is, what is a covenant? We throw that word around, but what is a covenant? What is a bris? So the Vilna Gaon taught what a bris is. A bris, I don't mean a brit milah, circumcision. I just mean a brit in general, a covenant. What's a covenant? So the term that's often used in the context of brit in the Torah of a bris is koret brit, which means to cut a covenant. You cut a covenant. So we know how you cut a circumcision, that type of covenant. But what does it mean in general for other types of covenants? What's the cutting that's going on? So the Vilna Gaon explained, Rabbi Eliyahu of Vilna explained in a beautiful way what a covenant is. He says that if a person has someone who they love and they don't want to be separated, but they know they can't remain together, a good friend, but he needs to travel on business, a lifelong friend. So he's going to be taking a ship, over the sea, and who knows when the next time they'll see each other is. So what do? How do you deal with that? So what you do is you give them a token by which to remember you, right? Like a locket or a letter or whatever it is, right? You give them something to take with them, and that way, even though you're far apart, but you'll always remain connected by this object, this item that connects you. And even though you're maybe apart in distance, but in thought, you could still be together. That's, he says, that's the idea. That's what a covenant is as well. A covenant is where it's a promise, it's a commitment that through whatever the covenant's going to be, we're not going to be separated. And so that's why, he says, that's why we use this language of koret brit. We cut a covenant because we cut a part of ourselves off and give it to the other person. And God in some way cuts from himself, so to speak, and gives to us. So there's always going to be, in a covenant, there's always going to be two sides, each giving to the other side. So in a brit milah, like that covenant, so it's obvious what we're cutting, what we're circumcising to give as our side of the bargain, but the other side God commits. So for example, in the verse that when Abraham gets his commandment to do a bris, so it says, it's number 10 here, I will place my covenant between me and you, God says, and that should be a capital Y, and I will increase your offspring very greatly. So God promises as a result that he'll make the Jewish people very great. That's his side of the bargain. And you'll remember me by that. That's his side of the bargain. Similarly, Shabbos is called a covenant, right? We say, Vishamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot et ha-Shabbat l'dorotam berit olam, beris olam. It's from the Shabbos day Kiddush. It's from the Torah. And we refer to Shabbos as an eternal covenant. So where is the covenant of Shabbos? Why is Shabbos called a covenant, Shabbat? And perhaps the reason can be understood based on a comment of one of the medieval commentators, the Chizkuni. And the Chizkuni says, he's commenting on the idea that the Torah says that Shabbat is a sign between us and God. Besides for that, it's a covenant, it's also a sign, a signal of some sorts, that we are signaling to God and he's signaling to us. But we understand how we signal to God with the observance of Shabbat. We by refraining from working on Shabbos and performing the positive commandments of Kiddush. So we are sanctifying Shabbos and we're remembering that God created the world in 6 days and resting on the seventh. That's our contribution. What's God's sign to us? So he says the fact that God gives us the Shabbos on the seventh day, just us, that's his day of rest. That was the day of rest that God rested. And he gives it to us. It shows a special love for the Jewish people, a special connection to the Jewish people. That's God's contribution. That's God's commitment to the covenant. And again, Shabbos therefore shows this unique relationship between us and God. The bris milah also, the circumcision, it's unique. There's a covenant, there's a bond here. We give to God, God gives to us. in another sense, bris milah is also us joining with God in perfecting creation. God creates the world almost perfect, but then he says, you be my partner in creation. You finish off the job by doing a circumcision. So also there, it's a special relationship with God in completing that action. And the last is Rosh Chodesh, the sanctifying of the new month. So this actually the Torah never describes as a bris, as a covenant, as far as I know, the idea of sanctifying a new month. But Reb Shamshon Raphael Hirsch teaches us a beautiful idea. He tells us that there is a covenant that's similar to the sighting of the new moon, and that was the covenant of the rainbow that Noah saw when he came out of the ark. So when Noah comes out of the ark, he sees a rainbow, and the Torah describes that God said, this rainbow represents a covenant between me and you, that I will never destroy the world as I did again. That was a covenant there. He says, similarly, seeing the new moon is a covenant. God says to Moshe, number 12 here, God said to Moshe and to Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, this renewal of the moon shall be to you the beginning of new moons. It shall be unto you the first of the months of the year. God says, look at the new moon. The renewal of the moon is going to be the beginning of new moons, being the beginning of months. When you see a new moon, you know it's a new month. But there's a covenant here going on. There's a commitment here that represents, just as the moon renews itself each month, so too, God says the Jewish people will always be able to renew themselves, to always experience revival. When things may go down and wane, but you'll always wax, you'll always grow again, you'll always recover, you'll always rebound. And we've seen that certainly throughout history over and over and over again, that this covenant is held true, that we always manage to rebound. So our job is to declare Rosh Chodesh, to sanctify the new month. God, on his side of the pact, make sure that the Jewish people have the opportunity to renew themselves and to rebound. So these three mitzvot all represent a special relationship that the Jewish people have with God. And as long as we remember that relationship, as long as we remember that those covenants and the unique role that we have as a chosen nation, then we can stand up to and resist the influences of the world and be the leaders still, and be and guide from our and role model from our Torah, from our own sources, without being influenced by the latest and greatest in the society around us. And that was what the Greeks wanted to do battle against. So they said, write on the horn of your ox that you have no portion in the God of Israel. So perhaps the idea of the portion in the God of Israel is this portion of the covenant that we're discussing now. We're saying that a covenant means that God gives us a piece of him, so to speak, and we give God a piece of us. And the Greeks were saying, no, there's no special relationship here. You have no piece of God. You have no portion in God. You don't have a special covenant. You don't have a special piece. You're not unique. You don't stand out. And therefore you should be subject to the influences of our society and to assimilation. And they wanted to drum that home. They wanted to drum it home because we're all impacted by the environment. So you know what they did? Perhaps we're going to offer two possible explanations. There are more, but why they said write it on the horn of an ox, it's very simple. You ever seen a bumper sticker? Right? Why do people put bumper stickers? Because they think that so-and-so should be president, or that they have a really important idea to share with the world. And they want everybody in the car behind them to know what they think, and hopefully it will rub off on them eventually, right? That's what a bumper sticker is. So the Greeks said, people rode oxen in those days, right? You get up on your ox, on the saddle or on your wagon, and what do you see right in front of you? You see the horns of the ox. So they said, right there, put a bumper sticker basically on the horn of your ox, this message. You have no special portion in the God of Israel. There's nothing unique. There's nothing unique about you. Just let us in. Let our culture in. There's no reason to resist. You don't have a special relationship with God. They wanted to drum that message home. Perhaps that's the idea of putting it on the horn of an ox. Or perhaps there's another idea. So I once heard this, I heard it first from Rabbi Pesach Kron. He was quoting someone else, one of the heads of the yeshiva in Gateshead in England. And the idea is that in the olden days, back in the day, in those times, the way that you fed a baby slowly before they had silicone nipples to using a baby bottle was you used a horn, because a horn has a very thin mouthpiece. And so you could fill it with water or milk or whatever, and the baby can drink. And the idea was, write this on your baby bottles. Write this from a very young age. We want this message, not that the babies were reading, but the point was that they already, from osmosis, from a very young age, wanted to drum home their ideals, their beliefs, and to infiltrate our thinking. And that's why they had us write it on the horns of an ox, because the horn of an ox, according to this, not while the horn was still on the ox, while the horn was off the ox and being used to feed your babies. This should be the mother's milk. This should be the message that you're feeding your children. You have no special covenant. You have no special relationship with God. That was what they wanted to drive home. But the Jewish people stood up, and they stood up like roses amongst thorns. Like we read in Shir Hashirim, Song of Songs, as a rose among thorns. It's number 14 here. As a rose among thorns, so is my beloved among the daughters. The Jewish people are compared to roses among thorns. And Rashi explains, as a rose among the thorns which pierce it, but it remains constant in its beauty and its redness, so is my beloved among the daughters. They entice her to pursue them, to stray like them after strange gods, but she remains firm in her faith. The Greeks tried to entice us and to convince us to abandon our ways, to abandon our mitzvos, and to take up their culture and their beliefs and their idols, but we stood firm in our faith. And that's why in the Ma'oz Tur, we refer to the people at that time as roses, because of this idea that a rose represents the ability to be a rose among thorns and to not resist the prickings and the influence of those around us. And lastly, to return to our first question, if the greatest and most important miracle was the miracle of the war, of the battle, of the salvation of the Jewish people, why is it that we celebrate and we focus so much on the lighting of the candles and the miracle of the lights lasting for 8 nights, which seems nice, but not so important? After all, it didn't make what would be different if it hadn't happened? So Rabbi Chaim Shmulevitz explains that that's exactly the idea. The reason why we celebrate that miracle so much is because it didn't have to happen. Because he says, you think about it, right? What actions demonstrate the most love? Is it the actions that we do for our children because we have to? You got to feed your child. Or is it something when we go above and beyond and we get them a beautiful gift or whatever, right? That for a spouse, for anyone, right? What is it that's the most meaningful? It's the acts that are above and beyond and unnecessary. Those are the ones that show the greatest love. So at this time, the Jewish people stood up. They stood up for who we are, for what we believe, that we don't want to become like the Greeks. We want to remain firm. We remained firm like roses, and we fought the battle, and God helped us, because of course God is going to save us. It's not going to just let us die out, right? In a way, you could say God had to do that. Obviously, God doesn't have to do it, but right? But that could have been the end. And maybe we would have left a little bit uncertain. We were victorious, God helped us, but does God, are we really so special to God? So then all of a sudden, though, they go and they find one jug of oil. It's only enough for one night. And they light it, and it lasts a second night, and a third night, and the fourth night, and fifth night, all the way till 8 nights until they have more oil to refill. And at that moment, at that time, all of a sudden, it's like a kiss on the cheek, a kiss from God. They say, it's not just, that God saved us, but look, God is actually demonstrating love for us. He's going above and beyond for us and affirming that which we affirmed, that which we went to great effort to affirm, the special bond, the special relationship that we have with God. God affirms that by making a miracle that goes above and beyond and is unnecessary, but especially meaningful because it's unnecessary. And it's a special display of love. And that's what we want to emphasize at this time, is that special relationship and that special act that God made for us. So to summarize, sorry if I'm a little over time, but we'll give a quick summary. To summarize, we said that it's very difficult to resist the influences of the environment around us. But ultimately, as Jews, we always want to look to our tradition for determining how to live and what values to keep sacred and what to believe. And it's difficult to resist the influence of the society and the environment. But what we have to go with is the understanding and the knowledge that we are tasked with the responsibility to be the influencers, to be the teachers, to be the role models. We're the firstborn. That's how we're referred to. And if we can be mindful of that and remember that unique task, that unique role, the unique bond that we have with God in that role, so then we can resist, we can overcome, and we can fulfill our mission of actually bringing light and teaching the world. And the Greeks wanted to quash that. They wanted to deny us that. They wanted to convince us that we weren't special. They wanted to take away all our covenants that we have with God, our special connection. And we fought and we overcame. And despite their attempts to drill this home, write this on the corner of your ox so that you see it every time you go somewhere, or so that your baby see it from a very young age, we overcame that message and fought back like roses among thorns and resisted their influence. And finally, when it came time to purify and return to the temple, and they lit the menorah, they lit the lights, they only had enough for one day, but God showed his love for us, special connection for us, and allowed the menorah to burn for 8 days, affirming and confirming the special relationship which we celebrate on Chanukah when we light the menorah for 8 nights. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Have a happy
Thank you very
Hanukkah.
much. Thank you.
Thank you. Hanukkah Sameach.